Hello, good afternoon. Great pleasure to have you all with us in today's session of the Goethe Center webinar series, The Aftermath of the COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. The series was launched in April with the aim of discussing concepts that are currently not mainstream and may or perhaps should become mainstream in the aftermath of COVID-19. Today is the 22nd session, and our speaker is Paul Maassen. He is the Chief Country Support at the Open Government Partnership. And he will talk about promoting accountable, responsive, and inclusive governance. The Open Government Partnership vision is that more government becomes sustainably more transparent, more accountable, more responsive to their own citizens, with the ultimate goal of improving quality of governance, as well as quality of services that the citizens receive. This presentation will share approaches and examples from across the globe that show that such a culture shift is possible if government and civil society work together. Paul Maassen started working with the Open Government Partnership in June 2012. He's currently the Chief Country Support, as we've said before. He leads the implementation of the strategy of OGP, engagement with and strategic support of all OGP stakeholders at the national and local level. He teams with staff in over 10 locations, supports global efforts at Open Government champions, primarily of government, civil society, in using OGP to further their objective on transparency, accountability, and participation. Before assuming this role, he was responsible for OGP support to civil society across the globe. He has a long track record in the role technology and media can play in changing people's life and the societies they live in. Prior to joining OGP, he was head of finance and partnership for WWF International Global Climate and Energy Initiative, working primarily with WWF offices in emerging economies to strengthen the design and sustainability of their programs. Prior to WWF, he was with HIVOS, the Dutch development organization, as program manager for the global ICT and media program. This is where he learned the ropes of being a funder and got a deep understanding of the complexity of realizing change in developing countries. He strongly believes in the potential of individuals to make a difference if they set their minds and gets the goal, including technology, to realize their potential. He was also involved in the establishment of the East African Citizen Agency Initiative, TWAWIZA. He attained private sector experience with the Dutch telecom company, KPN. Paul has a master's in industrial engineering and management, and he's based in Brussels. Now, the way we're gonna go, Paul will present for 25 minutes. Then we're gonna have a 20 minutes of Q&A. If you have any questions, please send it through the chat box, and then we wrap up. So without much ado, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Maya. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ali, and thank you for having us. It's always great to have an opportunity to speak to a new group of people about open government and open governance, and the difference is important, and I'll come to that in my speech. So the Open Government Partnership is built around three guiding principles, if you want, that underpin the concept of open government: transparency, accountability, participation. And remember those three, because I'll come back to them many times during my 25 minutes. But before going into some of the theory and processes, let me share a couple of experiences, a couple of stories that actually show what this means in practice. What does open government mean in practice? What does inclusive government mean in practice? OGP has been going for almost 10 years, and these are some of those snippets. So the first one, in Madrid in 2016, the city government created an online platform called Decide Madrid that would encourage direct participation of citizens in decision making. So residents can use that platform to not just decide who's in charge, right, the ballot box if you want, but also be in charge themselves. The overall ambition is to ensure that the government of Madrid is transparent, and widens public participation in decision making. About 400,000 people signed up to the platform in Madrid. As popular as Facebook, the growth of Facebook in Madrid, 100 million euros of the city's budget, about 5%, for citizens to discuss and decide what they wanted to use it on. More parks, better schools, more swimming pools, better daycare for children. It was up to a dialogue and to citizens. 90 governments by now have replicated, with the support of Madrid, that idea, including one country. Uruguay is now doing it at the national level. The next story, the next place I'm taking you to is Ukraine. In Ukraine, as probably many of you know, oligarchs had captured not just a full state, but also the procurement system. And what a bunch of tech-savvy activists did, together with reformers inside government, is create a set of online procurement platforms, open contracting platforms called Prozoro. Using available public data and with the support of government, the platform really opened up the procurement process. This had advantages for a whole range of actors. For the government, obviously, it made their procurement process more transparent. And by getting more bidders in a transparent process, they saved first 2 years, $1 billion. $1 billion they could use for other things that the country needs, healthcare, schools, etc. For the business sector, it worked because it created trust and a level playing field in actually what the procurement system looks like. Transparency about who would get the government contracts made it more worthwhile to actually bid for government contracts. So what you saw is that a wider range of actors actually received government contracts. So it created not just a level playing field, but also more competition on the private side. And for citizens, that savings led to more money for other things, as I already said. So it brought more services, but also helped restore slowly trust in government. Civil society complemented Prozoro with their own platform called Dozoro, which is a citizen monitoring platform, allowing citizens to actually see, okay, if the government handed out this contract, did that road actually get built? Did that school actually get built? And with the ability to flag it with the government, and the government committed to follow up. That same platform, Ukraine has now been using during the pandemic to also monitor and spend the COVID emergency procurement. Third example is Indonesia. Indonesia has a national system for registering and responding to complaints of citizens called Lapor. And they call it a no wrong door policy. They're using a lot of different channels for citizens to be able to flag with the government what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what's not working. The government, again, committed to respond. And you can do it through text messages, the app, the website, WhatsApp, Twitter, whatever you want to use. The complaints are centrally logged. The central unit makes sure that citizens get a response from whatever agency is responsible across government. If you don't get a response within 5 days, it's flagged up to go higher, and someone sort of pays attention and says, hey, what's happening here? The overall statistics are discussed at the highest political level, and they compare like, hey, your agency is slow, your agency is fast. With all of it combined, really contributing to improving sort of the government response rate and fix rate, if you want, to citizen complaint. And the final story to kick it off is from South Africa, where the government committed to create a portal to open up budget and spending information to citizens. Prior to this commitment, the information was everywhere in bits and pieces, but not really conducive to citizen interaction. By bringing it all in one place, working with civil society organization, working also with people that have the skills of really opening up dense information in an accessible way, it created opportunities to engage citizens, to engage with this information. Again, challenge the government on what they're seeing. The government made an explicit effort to bring in citizens by introducing things called what they called civic information drives. So really helping citizens understand how the Fulle Kamali platform worked. And using the portal, citizens have already created proposals for more housing, equal opportunities for women, road maintenance, and infrastructure. So another example of how citizens can be brought into government in a way. So this is the type of stuff the Open Government Partnership does. And we were created in 2011 by a bunch of champions of reform, both inside government and outside, who recognize that governments are much more likely to be credible and effective if they open up their doors to public input and oversight. And with the ambition, the overall ambition, in the words of one of our founders, former President Obama, for governments to get better in serving their citizens rather than serving themselves. With four core entry points into what we're doing. Again, transparency, accountability, participation, and using technology in doing so. So the original founding group, you can see them here on the photo, 8 governments, 9 civil society leaders. From the onset, try to do things very differently. It's a voluntary initiative, but from the beginning, there was equal power sharing between the government and civil society members on the steering committee, often with a slight advantage for the civil society members, just because they're so organized and are so good in advocacy in a way, that in that conversation, they sometimes are slightly more effective. At the time we were founded, we were seeing 2 parallel trends. There was a trend back in 2011, one towards more openness and one towards more closed government. We're still seeing that, but our ambition was to tip the balance in the favor of openness. In 2020, we see that openness has really come a long way, right? Things like open data, open procurement have really become much more standardized across the world, as have, for example, access to information laws. But the other side has also strengthened. At the moment, more people live in an autocracy than they live in a democracy. Everywhere, whether you're in Africa or Europe or Americas, there is this deep layer of anxiety and discontent, even before the Corona crisis, where migration and inequality and trade wars and real wars and populism and the decline of trust in public institutions are real. And there are leaders that are coming to power riding the wave of these anxieties, which is where a situation where sometimes democratic checks and balances and strong institutions and civil society are seen more as a nuisance than a necessity. So I will come back to these challenges because that's the bigger operating environment that we are operating in. So what does that mean for how OGP works in practice, right? That was the philosophy and the origins, but how does that then play out in practice? Well, this is a very dense slide that shows our theory of change. And it is the open government partnership. But one key thing to remember is that when you're talking about opening up government to other stakeholders, whether they're civil society or the private sector, and if you're talking about bringing in oversight institutions and parliaments, you're really talking about open governance, about opening up the whole space to all the actors that collectively can make a better society. So there's a whole range of partners and elements. If I talk about OGP, you can talk about us, where I sit, the Secretariat. You can talk about the steering committee. You can talk about all these reformers in all these countries. You can talk about the by now 78 countries that I remember. But everyone plays their own role in catalyzing that change and shaping the priorities and shaping this global agenda of opening up government. So our platform and how it works is designed by the reformers in government and civil society at the national level, the local level, and the international level. The countries that join OGP, in a way, simply said, and I'll come back to the details, they commit to making action plans. They make 2-year action plans with the reforms they're going to do. Now, the quality of those action plans, these cycles that you see in the middle of this slide, vary significantly between members. I have to be honest. Out of the 78 members, some are brilliant stars, others are like, well, not really there yet. But for it to work, you really need strong political commitment. You need an operating space for civil society. You need technical resources and financial resources. You need domestic and international coalitions. So there's a whole range of elements you need for this thing to work. But if that ecosystem at the heart of what open government and the open government partnership is works, then you see a model that starts delivering for citizens. And you start seeing that the commitments and the reforms made by OGP in small, and some of the stories you heard in the beginning, inspire bigger actions leading to some of the things you're seeing at the bottom on the right-hand side, the long-term ambition is making government work better for citizens. So improved quality of public policies and services, and a fundamentally different way of doing government. To do so, our role, our mission is not just to have every country do action plans. We also are here for building a strong global movement for open government and democracy. So going to the next slide. This is differently put what is in the theory of change, simpler in a way. So if you were a country that would like to join OGP, let's say Egypt at one point decides, look, we would like to join OGP. How does that work? Practically, what do members have to do? Well, first, not everyone can join. You have to be eligible. And to be eligible, there's two flavors of it. One, there has to be a technical eligibility. You have to have some sort of track record already on access to information, on budget transparency, on citizen engagement. That's the one side. The other side is there's a so-called value check. Is there actually a real operating space for civil society to use a business term, to enter the market and to operate in the market? If those two are in place, so if you're technically eligible and you meet the value check, then any country can join. What it needs is basically a letter from a political leader in which the leader endorses, or the government actually endorses, the Open Government Declaration, which is on our website. And then you're ready to start. So what do you practically commit to? Three things. You commit to a domestic dialogue between government, civil society, and other leaders at the national level that are important. They have a dialogue to co-create 2-year action plans with very concrete commitments of what change you want to bring about. That dialogue, and we have all kinds of rules around it, what the dialogue should look like, helps governments gain trust and build buy-in for the reforms in the action plan. The high-level political backing that is baked in, remember, it has to be a senior political leader applying for membership, helps unblock challenges and creates momentum for the process and the reforms. And from our side, we then monitor the quality of the dialogue, the quality and the depth of the dialogue, as well as the ambition and delivery of the individual reforms. Those country reports, progress reports, and learnings and challenges are shared publicly, and with that provides credibility and visibility to the reforms and the reformers, but also challenge countries to do better next time. And you see a race to the top, if you want, between the countries. Important to mention, it's a voluntary mechanism. So countries are not forced to join. We can't tell them to do certain things, but it's not without teeth. So there are, if you are in the partnership, but you don't do what we ask, then you will be called out on it, whether it's on the process side of not delivering action plans, or if it's on the value side. So there are also mechanisms in place for countries that violate the principles of open government to challenge those. So I already mentioned on the next slide some numbers that over time, we went from these original 8 countries to about 78 countries and 20 local members at the moment. There are 3,000 plus, probably many more civil society organizations involved. Collectively, they've created about 4,000 commitments over those close to 10 years. These commitments go from big and small, apples, oranges, everything you can think of. But I think it's interesting to see, and we'll come to the diversity of the open government agenda. They include many long fought for landmark reforms, if you want. Beneficial ownership disclosure in the UK, in Norway, in Slovakia, Nigeria, lobbying laws in Chile and Ireland, tech-enabled open contracting in Ukraine, Nigeria, Latvia, citizen monitoring service delivery, Mongolia, Uruguay, access to information laws, for the first time the introduction or really introducing new ones, Argentina, Kenya, and Morocco. So it's a really wide range of topics that are part of this agenda. And the next slide gives you an idea of that. Where we saw countries in 2011, 2012 make commitments really on the traditional openness topics: access to information, open data, fiscal transparency. Over time, the agenda has become much bigger. Gender, inclusion, natural resources, digital governance, including artificial intelligence, money and politics, right? How do political decisions get influenced by money, and where does the money come from? Access to justice, service delivery, I mentioned a few times. But it's important to notice that we are not telling governments what to do. That's not our role. We're not a standard setting body. It's not anyone that joins and says like, okay, by 5 years from now, this is what you have to have achieved. No, we're mandating a dialogue, a national dialogue, out of which ambitious commitments should come on whatever the country feels are the commitments they need at this point in time to improve their governance mechanism and their governance. But we do nudge, right? We do share inspiring, ambitious examples, or we have partnerships with international organizations and multilaterals, whether it's the World Bank or the OECD, to advocate. And we do bring technical expertise. So if a country says in a conversation, we're really struggling with natural resource governance, just to mention one, there is political will to do something on it, but we have no clue. We've never done it. Then we can bring in the expertise or the government reformers from other countries and say like, okay, help country A or B understand how you have done so. We also have rotating chairs, both on the government and civil society side, and they will also always bring in topics they are keen about. Some of the areas that are popular are growing. Public service delivery is a big one. Open contracting is a big one. And we see that growth areas, if you want, where we see more countries making commitments, SDGs, gender and inclusion, and digital governance are big ones. Beneficial ownership is also one. One of the strengths of the platform is the ability we have to translate, and this is important, to translate international conversations and pledges into national domestic action. So one example, I mean, as you know, often there's a lot of international conferences and nothing happens afterwards, right? So one of the things we bring is that, it's easily set with an example. So in 2016, there was a big anti-corruption summit in London. 43 countries were there, many of them OGP members. 22 out of the 43 actually afterwards used OGP to make very specific commitments on anti-corruption. So what they promised in London then became part of a national OGP dialogue, made it into action plans, and is now being delivered. So what we offer, and that's important, is translate international pledges and agendas into action, not top-down imposed, but more bottom-up desired, if you want. Very quickly on OGP local, which is again sort of how have we evolved over time? How does this governance agenda evolve over time? Local government is a big one, where we started as a platform of national conversations. Local has come in. Why is this so important? Local government obviously is much closer to the citizens. It's a level of government where citizens are much more keen to engage because it is about their lived realities. It is about their schools, their roads, their hospitals. And so this is a big growth area for us where we're really hoping to see much more membership over the coming years. Next slide, please. So switching to COVID, right, which is on all of our minds at the moment. So what does this mean? How does this change our agenda? Well, obviously for us, it has changed not so much our thinking of what the approach should be, but where specifically we can add value. So to ensure the fundamental values of accountability and transparency and inclusiveness are at the forefront of how governments meet the needs of their citizens, it was before COVID already important to work on trust of citizens in government. When emergency measures are taking place, that's even more important. We started a campaign called Open Response, Open Recovery, where response is the immediate response to the pandemic, recovery is the long-term response to the pandemic, which is all about building trust in the end, right? And how do you build trust? By bringing in especially transparency and inclusion into the emergency and longer-term recovery measures governments are taking. Citizens empower, whether they want it or not in a way, governments to unleash emergency powers, mobilize massive medical care, launch big stimulus packages, expecting governments to act with integrity and to open themselves to public scrutiny at the moment in time when we're ready for that again and we can spend our energy on that. But what we've learned is that what we see under normal circumstances can actually also be used under crisis, the multiple crises we now see unfold. So what are we seeing? The pandemic affects, of course, every aspect of our lives. And we can see it on the next slide, some of the aspects. I mean, you all know them. But on the right-hand side, you see some of the specific things we're seeing. Emergency measures in response to the pandemic have really affected various areas of open government, including civic space, right to information, government oversight, inclusion. Some of these quick government emergency responses make sense, others less so. But just to give you a few numbers, we know out of our 78 members, 15 have suspended or altered their access to information frameworks. More than half have restricted freedom of assembly, social distancing, so that's not a very strange one. But 1 in 5 have restricted media freedom. 12 are using emergency powers, including citizen surveillance methods. And in a situation where fast responses are important, you can understand some of it. But it also, in the same situation where governments are taking a lot of quick reactions, citizens' support for what they're doing is as important. And if you see in many countries across the world, citizens basically no longer accepting social distancing, no longer accepting lockdowns, you can see how that trust becomes really, really important. Next slide, please. Mindful of time, I'll try to speed up a little bit. So our fundamental values of accountability, transparency, and inclusivity are as vital as we move through the pandemic, as I said. But in the context of the challenges that we're seeing, we ask ourselves, how can we better coordinate our work? So as a mechanism, we've done a couple of things. We're really listening to our government and civil society folks. And okay, how can we help you? And we've done 3 concrete things. One is we've really made quick response in making our rules much more flexible. Can't do a new exit plan this year, we understand. Are behind with the implementation of reforms, we understand. At the same time, we're trying to help them with understanding what type of commitments they can now make and how they can use their OGP platforms and dialogues to respond to the pandemic. 2 quick examples. One quick example, in Latvia, normally they have open procurement, right? So whatever the government purchases goes online, very transparent. With the emergency procurement, that didn't happen initially. But very quickly, because there was already a dialogue between government and civil society on this topic, civil society came back to government, asked, hey, what's happening? We can understand you're busy. Can we help you to figure out how to quickly bring back that transparency that is so needed, which happened in a matter of days. The emergency contracts also made it back onto the website. Ukraine was a positive example there, where they're still using their Prozoro platform to do so. So we're trying to really give to our members both the practical tools. If you're used to dialogue and co-creation and working with civil society in person, in rooms, in meeting rooms, at the government offices, how do you take that online? How do you have a meaningful conversation online using Zoom like we're doing today? So that's a lot of the practical tools we're giving. Content, strategic, intellectual tools we're giving them is like, okay, if you're introducing big stimulus packages, this is how you can bring in open government. If you're introducing emergency procurement, this is how you can use open government. Next slide, please. So in the early stages, it was very much about accurate, proactive disclosure of information. So not closing down because you're busy, but actually opening up, right? Because the more proactive and honest you are about what's happening and how you're responding, the more trust you get and the more likely it is that citizens will actually listen to governments and what they're saying. So as governments scramble in a way to procure scarce emergency supplies, for example, open procedures can help build trust. So I already gave you the Latvia example, so let me not go in there. In the interest of time, go to the next slide, Maya, if you mind. So open response is short term, right? Where we said information, clarity, open, honest conversations is important. Emergency procurement is important. So inclusive and transparent. Long term, you see those come back, where there's a big role in our view for citizens to be part of shaping, but especially also overseeing some of these massive economic stimulus packages we're seeing, the need to strengthen health systems, the aid in budgetary flows. So on open budgets, on contracts, on beneficial ownership, on lobby transparency. We know that from history that when money moves as fast as it is moving at the moment as part of the response, there really is a risk of corruption, of inefficiency, of failure to reach the most marginalized. The scandals around sort of the purchase of medical equipment and masks shows what happens if government systems are stretched to the end and to a breaking point. And those are moments where bringing in citizens into government and shaping and overseeing can actually help you and help government to do the big tasks that they have. So most certainly the pandemic will lead to a global economic crisis, right? A depression, which inevitably also will use to a massive stimulus, bigger since we've seen since the Second World War, to revive economies. But not every country can do what it takes, right? So how do you make sure that even if you don't have the big money, but the smaller money, that you spend it wisely, that it doesn't end up in corruption? So speed and responsiveness are really important in jumpstarting response and recovery. Transparency and public oversight, especially of stimulus packages, are key to ensuring long-term that the recovery does what it needs to do and citizens' trust in government is sustained. Now that's where we can bring, as a partnership, as a community, a wealth of experience on how open government approaches and practices and stakeholders can look past previous OGP commitments and turn that experience into an open government-based response to the pandemic, if you want. So our key ask to our 78 members, national members, is to ensure that transparency and participation and public oversight are an integral and a mandated part of all response, recovery, and resilience measures. So then to the last slide, let me share one final story. Less than 2 years ago, the world watched as a citizen-led protest against corruption and elite capture fueled a movement that eventually in Armenia brought Nikol Pashinyan's government to power. And with the promise of a peaceful democratic revolution in Armenia, and of course it reminded very much of Arab Spring in a way, but in Armenia it was after decades of erosion of democratic institution. But today Armenia, under the leadership of Pashinyan, stands out as a bright light for democracy in the region. But however, you've seen in many places that the euphoria following some of these citizen revolutions and elections can quickly spiral back, right, to distrust and cynicism, and actually nothing changes. Credible reforms don't happen and don't address the underlying roots of the protest, such as elite capture and those populism and anxieties that I was talking about in the beginning. And that's where open government approaches can help and empower citizens to shape and oversee policies and services beyond the elections, beyond once every 4 years. So much more participatory democracy beyond the ballot box to sort of build trust and help deliver the next phase of the revolution. So when we met with the Prime Minister late last year, as other senior leaders in government and parliament, we discussed how the existing OGP platform, which was already strong in Armenia with the previous government, can actually help the government deliver on some of the asks of the street, some of the promises of the revolutions, and turning into real asks, which very often is very difficult to do, right? How do you turn the energy and action of the street into real reform? And that is where civil society has an important role to play. That's where progressive reformers in government have a big role to play. And that's where the international community, including Open Government Partnership, can help. So let me close. OGP, doing open government right, really demands a change in mindset. It's a very different way of doing government and governance. And it needs the commitment at all levels of government to do government differently, not just for citizens, but with citizens. In the end, open government should not be about just doing it for the principle or ticking the boxes or winning the next elections if you want. The idea really is to get more effective and more credible government that can help restore trust and strengthen the health of our societies. So let me stop there and hand back over to you, Wally.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks a lot. I have 2 points, and I'm just kind of sort of the first one is about the rise of populism and polarization in what is typically actually a democratic countries. I mean, a good example is the US. And to the extent that you start seeing even a chasm between the national government, the federal, and the local government, the states. This is one question. I mean, you're talking about a country. I mean, you could say that it is not really inclusive, but still, I mean, even if you take the minority side, when you talk about the populism, some of it does not have to do by ethnic groups. I mean, some of it is by a partisan. So this is one question: is how do you deal with this? I mean, this is for me is a paradox, and it's across Europe, by the way. I mean, you could argue that there are many countries in Europe that has an issue with a renegade sort of a state that would want to sort of split away. And that would be sort of issues and problems going forward. So this is the first question. The second one is about COVID-19. I mean, COVID-19, the role of government is very huge. The role of public spending is very huge because you have to sort of maintain the community and maintain the ecosystem. So you really have to give universal basic income. You have to give some money to the poor people, and you also have to support the SMEs to sort of pass through this. And most government would have to rely back in global finance. Now, when you get into this, you get into a different layer of governance that is actually more global governance. Global governance in terms of the UN, World Bank, IMF, and how do they distribute money based on what? I mean, I understand that governance is not a simple entity, but when the time we're going through right now, for me, global governance or international governance is very critical. So anyway, those are my two questions, and if I'm interested to see your points.
Yeah, just to start with 2 small questions. Look, for me, the rise of populism and polarization, which are linked but different, is in the end shows to people's unhappiness with their leaders, right? And it points to, as I said in the beginning, these anxieties and these stresses in the daily lives of people. What do they see? People are worried about job security. People are worried about cultural identity. People are worried about climate change. People are worried about a whole bunch of things. And they don't feel political leaders are necessarily fixing them. Now, the challenging thing is that, as I said in the beginning, the populist leaders, autocrats, very often ride these anxieties, right? They sort of tap into it and they translate them into very simple yes, no answers, and then people vote for them. And hardly ever do populist leaders actually deliver on what they said, right? I mean, Trump had an agenda on make America great again for the average normal American. If you look at what he spent his energy on, it was making it great again or better for the elites and the rich people at the top, right? That's where accountability comes in. So the challenge is real leadership that understands the underlying anxieties of people. What are they looking for? and leaders that can build bridges somehow between the groups. And those are very hard to find, right? We have very few of those type of leaders at the moment that can bring an alternative. So I think what we're faced with at the moment is we have a political class at the moment that doesn't connect to the lived realities of citizens and doesn't bring the solutions for citizens. And we have a bunch of political leaders that tap into that unrest and anxieties and make use of it, not to improve societies, but to improve either for their group, their clan, or their small group of friends. And by doing it, the challenge is what we're seeing is that they're using the same democratic institutions to break down democracy, right? Orban in Hungary is a good example, right? He's using the tools he has as a political leader to weaken the system that brought him to power. And for me, it sort of shows that democracy is not the laws and the institutions, it's part of it. That's the muscle of it, but it's not the soul of it, right? The soul of it is the people that are part of the governance system. The law and the institution in itself will never protect you if someone wants to undermine it. Where local government comes in is that very often the counter-revolution comes from the local level, right? Who is reinvigorating democracy in the US? It's at the state and the city level. That's where you see a lot of really interesting initiatives and a different type of leaders that really focus on dialogue with citizens and doing things differently. The same in many European countries, right? The progressive anti-Orban is the mayor of Budapest. The progressive anti-Duda in Poland is the mayor of Warsaw. So local government, in a way, often offers an alternative to the national level thing. But this is a long-term problem, Ali, and I think restoring trust of citizens in government and government in citizens in a way is critical. But okay, if you don't want to do it, if you're the leader that just wants to abuse the system rather than strengthen the system, I think we're in a period of time where that is possible, unfortunately. On your second question, you're right. I think a lot of international governance will come into fixing this, the response, the recovery phase of the pandemic. The challenge is, I think, that international set of institutions, whether it's the UN or the IMF or World Bank, has lost a lot of its credibility the last decade or so, right? And now suddenly we need them again. And I think one critical thing to watch, but it's too early to tell. I mean, again, when we speak with these institutions, we say the same: transparency, inclusion, accountability, right? Don't do this the old way, try to do it the new way, and bring in people and not just top-down imposing and top-down and sort of government being accountable up and not down, right? That's what you often see. So our push is to bring in some of these open government approaches and how they do it. And hopefully they've learned from what didn't work with previous crises, right? In terms of the conditions they imposed, etc. But that is a tough one, both because I think the trust in these international institutions is not very high. But yes, they are the one with the deep pockets at the moment that many countries, especially developing countries, mid-income countries, will need to look at because they don't have the deep pockets themselves to fix this crisis.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to pass it now to Kariman for questions from the audience. Kariman, floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ali. Thank you so much, Paul, for such a great presentation. A couple of questions. First, what can you do to convince non-participating countries where corruption is very rampant to join your OGP?
Myself for a second. It's a good one. I mean, there's not one size fits all, right? Because because people are different, the political leaders are different. So in the early days, we often got a question, so why do countries join, right? The interest of civil society is clear. Civil society gets a seat at the table, an equal seat at the table. So for civil society, the advantage is good, but what's in it for the political side? And it depends, right? Some political leaders, take the UK, for them it really was about, they really wanted to stimulate technology and the digital side and open data, and they saw open data as the next big oil boom. So for them it was about innovation. For a lot of the countries in the former Soviet Union, it was really about a break with the Soviet style of government, if you want. They were left with very corrupt, archaic bureaucracies that just needed to be revamped and opened up. So for them, that was interesting. Some joined because President Obama asked. But there is really different things in it. What we say nowadays when a country wants to join is, first we explain to them, okay, this is what you still need to do to be eligible, and this is what you need to do to make the most of it. If you want to do this and you want to do it properly, you have to do A, B, and C. But then the value pitch is always tailor-made for the country, for the leader. But for political leaders, it is very often a true commitment to change the culture of government. And in every government, there are people that are willing to do so and that are committed, right? So very often sort of in the beginning, it's often like civil society versus government. And then when you start talking, like, look, government is not a monolith, right? Government is also made up of citizens that have different backgrounds and different interests. So try to tap into these interests. But what's in it for government is an opportunity to learn from other governments on how to make government better and more efficient and more credible and more effective. And there is an opportunity in there to tap into the expertise and the support of other parts of society. Let me give you one very quick example of that. Australia wanted to do, it's a digital topic. They wanted to create guidelines around artificial intelligence. Big topic for many countries at the moment. And the minister had it in his mandate to just issue guidelines. I mean, he could, and then it would be done, easy task. But he decided not to, because he realized that artificial intelligence will radically change how not just governments, but societies work. And for his guidelines actually to make a difference, he realized he didn't fully have the technical expertise or his team to write the right ones, but also for them to actually have uptake, he needed the buy-in of the private sector, of the human rights organizations, because it very often touches on privacy, etc. So he realized he needed a coalition almost, and the buy-in of a subset of actors in society to make the guidelines work. So there was self-interest in it for him. Like he said, okay, I can do this, but then I have useless guidelines. Actually, if I want to make this work, I'd better talk to people in society, from the private sector all the way to parliament.
Thank you. Could you please give examples? Okay, sorry. Have you ever started working in a country and then things failed to work and you were compelled to give up and withdraw? If yes, could you please share with us some of the challenges you faced?
Yeah, a couple of examples there. I mean, there's two flavors, right? There's examples of countries that join and then don't do much, and then, you know, at one point we just tell them, like, look, you're no longer a member. Turkey is an example of that in your region. I mean, they joined with enthusiasm, then the government changed, the minister changed, nothing happened. Okay, that's fine, right? I mean, if you don't want to do it, it's okay. So that's more the technical sort of exit strategy, if you want. The other one is more on living up to the values, right? And so we have a mechanism called the response policy, where either other governments or civil society or multilateral organizations can flag, like, country A or B is not living up to transparency and openness. We've had the case of Hungary, for example, where the government was clamping down on civil society. there's a whole process. I won't bore you with the details, but in the end, our steering committee, so our government and civil society leaders, concluded that yes, indeed, the government of Hungary was not living up to it. The Hungarian response was they left the next day. They didn't want the dialogue. They didn't want to engage. They left. Counter to that is Azerbaijan, who had a very similar case. And they had a similar conclusion of the report. In Azerbaijan, both government and civil society said, actually, we don't want to leave. We agree or don't fully agree or partially agree with what you're saying, but actually let us continue the conversation and this process. And let's see if we can use OGP to actually remedy the situation. Now, remedying the political system and the civic space in Azerbaijan is a big task, right? Bigger than any organization can do. But it was interesting that they found it important to keep the international spotlight and to keep the conversation. Final example, you have countries like Philippines and Mexico, where also not everything is spot clean, and where civil society has addressed their concerns. But in both cases, they actually have used the space of OGP to either overcome the problems. Mexico, it was government spying on civil society, but then they used OGP to create a commitment against state surveillance and curbing it back, a commitment created by government and civil society. That is a very interesting one. In the Philippines, civil society decided, okay, under this current government, look, we shouldn't have a dialogue with the government about human rights and things like that. That's just not the right time. But we can still make a lot of progress around education and health and all of these things. So let's continue the conversation about opening up government, but do it in safe spaces, which is, let's focus on certain areas where we will not get into an immediate fight with the current government of President Duterte. So there's all ways of doing it. But if a country really is not living up to their values, then there is basically an exit strategy.
Thank you so much. Nations around the world are not homogeneous. Countries have their own culture and history. If you can talk a bit with examples from your hands-on experience working with different people around the globe, how significant is the role of culture in shaping people's perspective about democracy?
Good question. Look, I mean, we're not a democracy support organization, right? I mean, just to like you especially currently they don't have much legitimacy, the Americans, but traditionally they had a big democracy support agenda, right? We're not a democracy support organization. We are very much a new flavor of an international, multilateral, multi-stakeholder, where we say, look, every country, and as you said, every country is different starting point, different culture. And that's why I was saying in the presentation, we're not standard setting. We're not mandating countries to do certain reforms, right? It's not like the EU accession program, for example. You have to do this, 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 and this, tick all these boxes, have these laws, and then you're fine. Because we know you're not fine then, right? That's again, it's the muscle of the laws and the institutions. It's not the soul of democracy. So we very much leave it up to every country to have their dialogue and see what they're doing. So if a country says, actually for us, bringing in citizens in shaping service delivery, that's for us the most important. Don't come to us with lobby transparency or access to information laws. That's not what we want to do. Then that's perfectly fine. What we bring is two things. One is we say, look, for this to be serious and to work, there has to be a few things in place, right? If there's no space for civil society to have an honest dialogue with government, then our model doesn't work, right? We can still be friends, but our model doesn't work because it's based on an equal conversation between the two. So that needs to be in place. The other thing is you have to put energy in it. So whatever commitment you make on whatever topic you care about, it has to be ambitious and it has to be delivered. And we have rules and standards about that dialogue between government and civil society. That's what we do. But for the rest, what you have your conversation about and the commitments you make is up to you. What we do bring is the comparisons and the examples and the ideas from other countries, right? If in our partnership, out of the 78, 65 countries are making commitments around open contracting, opening up that whole massive amount of money that governments spend on contracts, which is a big risk for inefficiency and corruption. If 60 out of 78 are doing that, then probably the other 18 should also think about it, right? Because probably there is something there that's important. So we nudge, we inspire, but we're not telling. And that's our way of allowing for different cultures and different paces in a way of the reform to take place.
Thank you so much. Paul, do you offer these programs well articulated in local languages in order to encourage average population to actively participate in the process?
Yeah, so two answers to that. So we as a secretariat, and we are an international organization, but just to give you a perspective, I don't know how many people work at the World Bank or the IMF, but at OGP we have 60 people, 60, that's it. So we're very small multilateral, right? It's a big difference. So our ability to sort of function like some of these bigger ones like the UN and the World Bank we're very different. So what we do is our key materials we translate into 3 languages only, French, English, and Spanish. But we do encourage and push countries to have their national conversations in the local language, right? Because of course that's important. What we also tell them then, if you bring that back to us, it has to be in English, because otherwise you don't get that international sharing of experiences. Mm-hmm. So English is the key language across the partnership. French and Spanish are very important, especially in Africa and in Latin America. And for the rest, we leave it up to the national members to work on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Paul. You're right, we can talk about this for the whole day, but unfortunately we're running out of time. Thank you so much. That was so inspiring. Thank you so much.
Very welcome.
Paul, I'm reiterating what Kariman said. This has been very inspiring, very thought-provoking. I mean, for me, I'll probably need to sort of think about many of the points raised. So I thank you, and I thank Maya for the participation. This is really our sort of grand finale of the series before the summer hiatus. And then we're going to start back in last week of August or September. I mean, we all need a break, I'm assuming. But we're going to start. So for the participants, please stay tuned. We will probably reach out for you. We'll tell you the new schedule starting from end of August, September. We might even before that ask you for feedback about the type of topics, the type of presentation, how do we communicate with you. So again, I thank you, Paul. Thank you, Maya. Thank you for all the participants. And I look forward to seeing you back in end of August, early September. Please stay tuned. Stay safe. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Kariman.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.